So, hello and welcome to myNewsWrap, my curated and opinionated news about SAP and Microsoft. This week there was quite some stuff going on. Let's go back to last week's myNewsWrap. There was one blog post by Tobias Hoffmann that I referenced, and well, that went quite through the roof. I don't assume it was because I referenced it, but no, who knows. Nevertheless, there was quite some stuff going on around that blog. If you remember it, it was about SAP Cloud Platform and the shortcomings of the current trial offering because of the temporal limitation of your account. And yeah, there have been some further blog posts that came out. One by Dan Hewlett of Diginomica, which was kind of picking the stuff up and mixing it up again and bringing quite some attention to the topic too. There was another blog post by Jelena Perfiliga on the SAP community, who also picked up the topic by Tobias' original blog post, brought in some personal experience with Oracle, and then if you scroll down, there are quite some comments, so the topic is really hot, and yeah, there is quite some interest and quite some pressure on that area. And if you scroll down far enough, you will also see that there is one post by Jürgen Müller, CTO and member of the board of SAP, who picks up the topic. And that's, from my perspective, at least some good indication. There have been two answers to that area, at least that I'm aware of, from persons that are really in charge of SAP Cloud Platform. One was Stefan Schad, who replied to a post by Gregor Wolf, who said they are on it. So they're listening to the problem and they're on it. Stefan is, I think, product manager for SAP Cloud Platform. And there was another one by Jürgen Müller, who replied to Dan that he will push things forward and things will change when it comes to SAP Cloud Platform and the developer trial. So let's see if the actions will follow to these announcements. I'm quite curious. I would say we can expect something at TechEd, so just as a feeling of guts. If something comes, then I think it will be announced there, because that's the right platform for such an announcement. But if nothing comes, I'm quite interested to see what's the aftermath after the subTechEd, if there is no real convincing offering for a developer trial on SAP Cloud Platform. Now, there was another post by Tobias Hoffmann, quite interesting one from my perspective, that picked up the topic of a trial. And also stress the topic of free tiering, like all the other folks have. And I just saw that I did not share my screen. That's great. So now you hopefully see my screen. So as usual, all the links are in the show notes. So there is another blog by Tobias, who proposes a quite creative alternative model for SAP Cloud Platform trial that is based on a containerized approach, where all the offerings are available through a container registry, and you can deploy them to the cloud offering where you want to. I really like the approach. I think there are really services like Kima that already follow that approach, but I'm not quite sure if really every service on SAP Cloud Platform can follow that paradigm. So I think there will be technical restrictions due to the way the services are built, due to the way they interact with the Cloud Foundry and the Gartner platform underneath. Yeah, so I think it's really nice to read. It's food for the brain, but I'm not really sure that SAP will pick that one up. But let's see. Perhaps next week I have several blog posts on that topic. Okay, so then there is another announcement around the SAP Cloud Platform that was pushed out this week. You, from my perspective, completely forget about the blog post itself. There are mainly two messages out there. One is the SAP Cloud Platform Extension Factory is now renamed to Cloud Platform Extension Suite. So just if you look for documentation and so on and for slides, this will be the new name of this baby. And there is another announcement that's quite important from my perspective, that renames the extension runtimes or the extension factories. So if you remember, if you took a look at SAP Cloud Platform Kima Runtime, this one was called Extension Factory Kima Runtime. Now this extension factory thingy was removed. And I think that makes sense. Also for the serverless runtime and for the application runtime, which is basically the Cloud Foundry runtime. Why do I think that makes sense? Because all these runtimes, they are not only for extending application, but you can also build applications within that runtime. So I think that makes things clearer from the perspective of conciseness of the naming. Nevertheless, for especially customers, it's another round of renaming and it's another round of confusion I'm thinking of. But if you see those offerings, so this is now their official correct naming. Okay, what else happened on the SAP Cloud Platform? Well, as we see now, the cloud platform, from my perspective, matures in a lot of areas. And one point where it's really maturing is tooling and operations. We have here now the introduction of cloud management tools. It's a two-part block for SAP Cloud Platform. One is a consistent CLI in order to interact with SAP Cloud Platform. And one is dealing with a set of APIs. So yeah, I think quite important if you really want to interact with SAP Cloud Platform. Every other platform that I know has something like that. Now we have one consistent CLI and one consistent API to interact with SAP Cloud Platform, especially for operations topics. What else did I come across? I came across a post of Marius Obert, one of the developer advocates of SAP. And he's one repo where he has a lot of examples for HTML5 applications for the SAP Cloud Platform multi-cloud environment, which will help you to see how to deploy HTML5 applications with app router, without app router, with portal, and so on and so forth. So I think if you are dealing with HTML5 applications on SAP Cloud Platform, this is definitely a repo you should take a look at. Now we have another one. There is another service that came out, managed service for integration and delivery, so CI/CD DevOps area on SAP Cloud Platform. And Murali wrote a little blog post about that offering and how to bring it to life. He also defined or pictured out where this service comes into play with respect to flexibility and with respect to expertise. And he also brought in a little video about that offering. So definitely something to take a look at if you want to make your feet wet in that area. There is also one important mentioning here. I don't know if I find it now. Some services, so the service itself, the Cloud Continuous Integration Delivery Service, is unfortunately, and here we are again, not available in the trial landscape, so at least not at the moment. However, some components like the alert notification service are available within a trial landscape. So if you really want to do it in the trial, you're not yet able to do that. Okay, then let's switch forward towards the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model. There haven't been big announcements. There is one podcast that I want to make you aware of. It's a podcast series. It's Close the Gap. It's called Close the Gap. And the episode 18 deals or has an interview about the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model. It's in German. The guests are Christian Georgi and Ivona Hahn. Those of you who follow Cloud Application Programming Model, for example, on Twitter, are quite aware of those two guys. And yeah, it's a nice and quite long podcast. It's not for techies, so it's not going into the depth about the technology of Cloud Application Programming Model and what's happening exactly under the hood. It's more for entering this area to get a high-level overview. And I think it's also quite good for, let's call the target audience managers who don't have a very deep technical understanding, but kind of want to get a grasp onto the Cloud Application Programming Model. What's the idea behind it? Why does it make the life easier of developers? So for this audience, it's really a perfect podcast from my perspective. So if you listen to it, do it with the right expectation in the back of your head. Then we have another one, a blog that came out last week, or a bit more than last week, about the SAP Cloud Application Programming Model CAP service, using it with an analytical focus, so exposing a donut chart or displaying a donut chart on a Fiori page. And this is really a step-by-step guide. What do you have to do? And I think what's extremely valuable is what annotations do you have to put where. I mean, it's quite a lot of annotations out there, and they are really distributed here and there. And this blog post really, I think, helps you if you want to get started with that stuff. So yeah, quite nice work from my perspective. Then typically next we would talk about Kyma. There are no real big news about Kyma, but I want to draw your attention to DSHE Live, which is the annual meeting of the German-speaking user group, which is a purely virtual event this year. And within the special interest group development, we will have one talk about Kyma by SAP IT. So we will have some insight into SAP drinking their own champagne or eating their own dog food, whatever you prefer, by using Kyma for their own purposes in their own real life with customer interaction. So I think that will be a really cool, nice talk. And yeah, if you have not yet registered, I would recommend to do so. I think this talk is worth it. Just as a little teaser. Now, I have one area that I did not have up to now, which is the ABAP's not bad area. So I don't know if I will have that every time, but last week there have been quite some announcement in that area that I want to draw your attention to. One thing is the RAP generator, so the ABAP RESTful Programming Model generator, which helps you with scaffolding your projects. It's been out quite a while now. It's an open source project, And you have now some click-through guidance how to use the ROP generator. This I think is quite helpful, and that's new, that's brand new, came out that week. So if you have to deal with the RESTful ABAP programming model, and if you want not to implement everything manually, then go for this generator. It's now a bit easier to use and a bit more intuitive. And another thing for the ABAP folks out there, those of you who have been around with ABAP since quite some time know that there have been the CDS views that have been introduced with SAP NetWeaver 7.4. I think the adoption is not that big out in the wild, but there is already a new generation of CDS views with CDS view entities, which is coming with the ABAP release 7.55. So with the next SAP S/4HANA release, I would guess this would be the right release, where you have a new type called CDS view entity, which overcomes a lot of shortcomings of the classical CDS views. So if you are working in that area, I would recommend to take a look what's coming, even if you might not be able to use it now. That's all from the SAP part of the house. So now let's switch to the Microsoft part of the house, and especially to my beloved Azure Functions. There is one very cool blog post that came out due to the serverless September, which tells you a bit more about Azure Functions, because I think most of the people think that Azure Functions are tied to Azure. So you can only run Azure Functions within Azure, and that's wrong. Azure Functions are open source, and they have built-in support, even on command line, to create a Docker image out of the Azure Functions, and so you can deploy them wherever you want, wherever there are containers running. So this blog describes a bit how to do that, and it also brings up one additional aspect that you have to take into account if you want to deploy Azure Functions, for example, as a container in a Kubernetes cluster, and that's a project called KEDA. It's referenced here. The idea is if you are in the Kubernetes world, the pods are scaled out by the operational plane of Kubernetes. And the thing that is responsible for that is the horizontal pod autoscaler. And this horizontal pod autoscaler reacts on some specific metrics, usually CPU load and perhaps memory. And that's not really perfectly fitting to the, let's say, demands of an event-driven function. And that is where a project KEDA, which is also open source, kicks in, because it enriches this horizontal pod autoscaler in order to make the story really a complete story, and allows you scaling based on events. So if you're interested in that, take a look at it. There is also a new release of KEDA 2.0 in beta, which introduces some new functionalities for KEDA, and also lifts, I think, some shortcomings. Quite nice stuff. Then there is another blog post that came out, which is also interesting, because this is, from my perspective, one of the classical ways how to use serverless and how to use functions, and that's refactoring a classical back-end application, a Node.js application with Express APIs that you might have deployed, and now you want to go over to the serverless approach. And there was a webinar, a workshop on that topic. You can watch it. The link is here. It's available on YouTube. And this guides you on a step-by-step way through refactoring your Node.js Express APIs to Azure Function applications. So that's one classical use case where you should go that way. Then another aspect around Azure Functions that I usually stress whenever I talk about Azure Functions is it's not only for developers, but Azure Functions also support PowerShell. So it's not only, Java, .NET, C#, TypeScript, JavaScript, Python. It also supports PowerShell, and this makes it, like this blog post says, a Swiss Army knife for operations. So this really can help you with your ops tasks within Azure a lot. So if you're interested, if you're an ops guy, if you're working with Microsoft Azure, take a look at that one. It's also, from my perspective, quite interesting, for example, if you're running SAP workloads on Azure. So also there, this can come in quite handy. So talking about operations and Microsoft, those of you who work with Azure, they are quite aware that you can and you should do infrastructure as code on Azure. You should do it on any platform. On Azure, you have one way to do that, and that's using ARM templates. ARM stands for Azure Resource Manager, so it's the interface layer to the complete resource management on Azure. And there is one blog post series with 10 parts all around ARM templates, how to use them, what functionalities are in there, what you can do. You see here, for example, how to do loops within ARM templates in order to spin up your infrastructure, your resources on Azure. Now, for all of you who have worked with ARM, you know that it works. It's not the perfect way, or it's not the most comfortable way in order to interact with resources in Azure. And that's why Microsoft decided to bring in some abstraction layer on top. And that's called, no joke, Azure Bicep. It's an open source, like nearly everything that Microsoft currently does in the area of development, an open source ARM template alternative that is built as an abstraction on top of ARM templates and uses some declarative domain-specific language. That's quite new. This blog post gives you some basic information, how to install Azure Bicep, how to do the basic syntax around parameters and so on and so forth. There is also one blog post that goes more into depth in the IoT area with IoT Hub and DPS, the device provisioning service of Azure, how you can leverage the power of Azure Bicep there. And today there was one new blog post. As I said, it's really brand new. I think it's version 2.1. Yeah, it's version 2.1, which was released now. And there is a roadmap now that came out that highlights the different steps that will come out until January 2021. So, for example, up to now, there are no loops, there are no conditionals within Azure Bicep, but they are going to come at least latest next year. So if you are in charge of the topics and if you are really working with infrastructure as code, you should take a look at that one, because I think it's much more comfortable than dealing with plain ARM templates. Okay, so that's it from the Microsoft part of the house. Unfortunately, this week I do not really have any news about SAP and Microsoft, so at least I did not come across anything. If you came across anything, just leave me an issue in the GitHub repo. I will take a look at that. So no news from that area. So I have two more news concerning, let's say, more general information. One thing, it's from Microsoft, but I think it's transferable to every other cloud and development of APIs. So it's a short video or interview about how Microsoft creates APIs. So what are their approaches, their design approaches on creating APIs for Microsoft. I think quite an interesting point of view if you're dealing with APIs, if you're working with APIs, if you have to develop APIs, because it's always a bit tricky to make really good APIs. And well, perhaps this little video helps you with that undercoming. Then there is one further area of resource that I want to draw your attention to. It's also quite new. If you're interested in Azure and if you're interested in the ecosystem around Azure, there is this Azure Crazy web page, landing page that came out. It's new. There is not too much content on there up to now. There are a lot of interviews with folks from the Azure ecosystem, like here Gregor Sati, who is interviewed. So if you want to take a little look into the Azure ecosystem, this might be a nice landing page. Then we have two more topics on the page. We have developer productivity. So for those of you who are not working on a Mac, who use Windows, like me, but who like to use Linux on Windows, there is the Windows subsystem for Linux version 2 that came out, I think, at the beginning of this year. And it's downported to 1903 and 1909. So if you are on a lower version of Windows, which especially is the case with, I think, corporate equipment, like corporate laptops, corporate workstations, because usually corporate IT is quite conservative, this might be your way to get along with WSL2. So that's out, so you can now install and use Linux on your Windows system. Then we have one other news. Perhaps you came across Visual Studio Code Spaces. They are nothing new. They have been announced quite some time ago. They are the kind of pendant to the Business Application Studio. So it's the Visual Studio Code kind of cloud-provided development environment that was announced by Microsoft and was quite well received by all the developers. And then later last year, I think, GitHub brought out something comparable, which was GitHub Code Spaces, which from my perspective was the same thing, just based on the GitHub ecosystem. And now Microsoft decided that they will consolidate those two offerings, and they are moving to GitHub Code Spaces. So they are leaving behind Visual Studio Code Spaces, and the go-to place is GitHub Code Spaces. This blog tells you a bit about the background, why they do it, and what's coming next. And for those of you who are using Visual Studio Code Spaces, how to proceed. So also quite interesting announcement. And yeah, one could now clearly see, I think, that Microsoft is also pushing their ecosystem around GitHub. And this way also leveraging developer productivity. Okay, so that's it from that section. And then, as you know, I usually, if I have somebody, I bring some person to your attention that it might make sense to follow. And this time it's the host of the Close the Gap podcast. It's Christian Michel. As I said before, this podcast is business technology, so it's not for the hardcore techies, but I have now listened to some episodes, and I personally like the way the stuff is presented. I like the different point of view of that, and I really like the enthusiasm and the sophisticated way how Christian is presenting all the stuff. So if you are interested in that area, and if you want to have also some different point of views on the technology in the SAP area, then I think it's worth following this person. Okay, yeah, that's it from my side. I have not more news about SAP, about Microsoft. There is one mentioning here concerning the CDS View entities. Yeah, on-prem they will be available on S4HANA 2020, so on the upcoming S4HANA release. In the cloud, it's already available since ABAP Cloud Platform 2008, so since the August release of Steampunk. Thanks, Søren, for the hint. So, yeah, that's it. I thank you for listening, for watching. If you have any input, just drop an issue in the GitHub repo that is available for this episode and for all the other episodes that are out there. And yeah, I hope to hear you next week at episode 4. Have a nice Friday, have a nice weekend, and till then, bye.